Today we have a very special guest. Anne Hilton is an Indigenous entrepreneur, CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, as well as a speaker and an author.
It's important to understand that when Indigenous nations and Indigenous businesses do well, that fundamentally our well-being and our future generations are at the heart of that.
Her first book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, came out in 2021. It helped define the emerging modern Indigenous economy. And her new book is titled The Rise of Indigenous Economic Power, Deconstructing Indian Act Economics.
It's time to start talking about Indian Act economics. The systemic economic exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the land, from the resources, and from the economic structures for our inclusion.
You'll hear a conversation between Anne and Clint Davis, the CEO of Cedar Leaf Capital, the first Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned investment dealer in Canada. They talk about Anne's new book, the historic and ongoing impacts of the Indian Act, the massive potential of the Indigenous economy in Canada, and much more.
It's time to have a framing point of what is Indigenous economic power? How is it rising? What does it look like? What does that mean?
I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Now, here's Clint Davis.
Anne, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We're going to get right into it. So, Anne, you have this new book coming out. It's your second book, Rise of Indigenous Economic Power, Deconstructing the Indian Act. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I think that it was a book that wanted to be written and that it brings into focus the duality of the experience of the rise of Indigenous power and the experience of the deconstruction of Indian Act economics. And to be able to bring this into Canadian reality, to have a conversation about what is Indian Act economics, what is the ethics, what is the alignment to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's a book that opens up the conversation around what we've inherited through the Indian Act and brings our leadership forward to have that conversation.
So it's been 4 years since you've had exceptional success with your first book. And your new book now, I know it's going to be extremely difficult to try and summarize such a deeply researched and complex book. But just to get us started, tell me, why did you feel the need to get into this second book, and what were you trying to accomplish with the writing of it?
Yes, I believe that it's time to start talking about Indian Act economics. It's time to have a framing point of what is Indigenous economic power? How is it rising? What does it look like? What does that mean? What did we inherit within the Indigenous economic relationship? How do we talk about it? And that main point of, it's time to start talking about Indian Act economics as the increasing ownership of massive equity projects of nations, of increased investment, increasing land base, all of those aspects. It becomes really important to understand the failing of the Indian Act system in the rise of the Indigenous economy today.
So in your book, you describe in detail the many and ongoing impacts of the Indian Act on Indigenous people. In particular, as you just mentioned, you're talking about Indian Act economics, hindering self-governance, economic development, and self-determination. You write that the Indian Act economics is the economics of inequality. So tell us a little bit more about that. I want you to dive a bit deeper into that. What do you mean?
I think there's this obsession with measuring the socioeconomic gap, and the lack of attention on the cause of that brings us to the foundation of Indian Act economics, the systemic economic exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the land, from the resources, and from the economic structures for our inclusion. That is essentially the principle of this concept of Indian Act economics, and being able to refer specifically to the structural constraints that are imposed by the Indian Act from the very beginning until today, and the historical limitations of Indigenous economic self-determination, that restriction of land ownership, business opportunities, and access to capital. All of those restrictions and limitations to our identity and who we are still exist today. The system itself fosters economic dependency and the consistent reinforcing of the Indigenous relationship on the cost side narrative of this country that overlooks Indigenous economic contributions. The concept of Indigenomics is really about actively dismantling these barriers by promoting economic self-determination that drives own source revenue, equity ownership, and investment across key sectors. It's in this concept, drawing from my first book of Indigenous Peoples taking our place at the economic table from a seat that has been so long denied to us. I think it's also important to highlight that these legal victories, policy reform, increased economic participation through the activities of economic reconciliation, that this moment that we're in, Indigenous nations are essentially reclaiming control of our financial and economic future. And while in my early work of driving $100 billion national Indigenous economic target, the realization of that is unfolding in real time. And this demonstration of our resilience of Indigenous peoples and businesses is essential to pay attention to right now.
So the Indian Act itself was passed in 1876. As you know intimately well, that there's been a number of amendments, revisions, etc. And you did reference how it still impacts Indigenous people today, almost 150 years later. Can you give some examples with, even though there's a lot of activity that's happening with Indigenous communities in business as it stands, give us your sense as to how that's still impacting Indigenous economic development today.
Yes, absolutely. So in the book, I essentially describe this pace of business, that there's a pace that exists within the mainstream economy and the expectations of, the regulatory or licensing or the structures that are set up to be able to do that. The limitations within this concept of Indian Act economics and the unfoldment of Indigenous economic exclusion to date. While we have a full spectrum of nations across self-government, various definitions of that, or historical treaty, modern treaty, it's essential to understand that for the full set of nations still operating within the reserve systems, that this concept of lands held in trust, monies held in trust, the bureaucratic pace of business in itself is affecting not only how the success of Indigenous businesses, the pace of investment, the perception of investment into Indigenous businesses, but there's a whole process of how industry is responding to the perception of Indian Act economics and the slower pace of how business is done, the externalization of decision-making, the externalization of internal systems that require ministerial confirmation is unlikely to be acceptable within a mainstream economic framework, and particularly in this time of economic complexity of Canada as a whole. So being able to place the rise of Indigenous economic power with relevant responsive systems is an essential moment to begin speaking about what is Indian Act economics and how does it impact us as individual Canadians, as companies, as sectors, and as governments.
So you write that Indian Act economics also impacts non-Indigenous Canadians, even though they have no idea about that. Can you describe a bit more what that impact is?
Absolutely. I think there's this concept of economic trauma. A couple years ago, we saw that in the formation of the leadership from the Kamloops Nation, who described 156 Indigenous burial points of children attending the residential school. That legacy of the residential schools, the exclusion, the denial of Indigenous existence, there's an economic trauma and how we perceive the Indigenous relationship that while there's a baggage and a bias to that, it's essential to understand that what has been passed down and what is transferred through the Indian Act is transferred to every single Canadian. And by that, I mean, whether that's newcomers, whether that's families that have been here for generations, that's businesses, that there is an effect of the Indian Act and the pace of business. The rise of Indigenous economic self-determination also affects every single Canadian. And it's important to understand that when Indigenous nations and Indigenous businesses do well, that fundamentally our well-being and our future generations are at the heart of that. And that when Indigenous nations and peoples do well, it also means that regional economies do well. That connects to the national economy, and that begins to culminate into a distinct numerical value of what does $100 billion of Indigenous economic activity look like. That looks like infrastructure ownership. That looks like equity participation. That looks like Indigenous peoples accessing capital markets in new ways. It means new financial partnerships. It means new structures. It means a massive trend of corporate economic reconciliation planning, where accountable, transparent, communicated outcomes of economic reconciliation can be identified, tracked, and numerical values placed within that. And that concept of the Indigenomics effect of looking at how do we describe the trends of Indigenous economic power and how do we place that in comparison to the holdback or the barriers or limitations that we experience as Indigenous businesses in relationship to the Indian Act and that concept of Indian Act economics itself.
So parlaying that into this next question, you do write about creating new paths for First Nations as they move from managing poverty to managing wealth. So just tell us a little bit about what you view as some of those paths.
I think that we're seeing this phenomenal rise of Indigenous entrepreneurs, of small, medium enterprises, of small companies who are all believing in an alternative story about our villages and our homelands and our future, where what has been inherited through the Indian Act has been this system of exclusion and this language of exclusion. And the experience of this Indigenous socioeconomic gap has been very real, and that those are people and numbers and experiences behind that. And this rise of Indigenous entrepreneurship is creating generational impact, where it's an interception of what has been looked at as what we've inherited through the Indian Act, and actually that interception to ourselves as Indigenous peoples through business, creating a new reality and a new future and a new multi-generational impact, I think is really important. So that pathway is something to be considered and really looked at as a formidable experience of resilience of Indigenous peoples in the place of denial of our existence. I think those pathways also include Indigenous equity ownership. When you look to groups such as the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, who is identifying billions and billions of dollars of Indigenous projects that are all lining up to be financed, and that the place at the table for us as Indigenous peoples is now we're equity holders, and to look at that in terms of energy corridors, to look at that in terms of, major transportation lines, oil and gas, whatever those aspects are, the place that we've created for ourselves to participate within economic activities that's happening within our territories, it's essential to understand that Indigenous peoples are taking our seat at the economic table, and that provides an opportunity for everyone. And the realization of that development of Indigenous peoples literally taking our seat at the economic table as corporate directors. So as we see these examples of the critical mineral space of resourcing a low carbon global future, that these resources are reflected within the requirements for Indigenous economic participation today. So those are all pathways that demonstrate our place that we're taking at the economic table and the pathway for our inclusion and our economic self-determination.
So the Indigenomics Institute, for which you are the founder, the creator, developed the goal of achieving a $100 billion Indigenous economy. How did you arrive at that number? And tell us, where do you think we stand today, and how soon will we actually be able to achieve that number?
Yeah, that's a great question. The concept came to me when I was serving as a senior advisor on the Federal Economic Growth Council under this current Liberal mandate. And what I saw was the population number of Indigenous peoples at about 5%. And when we looked at the generative outputs of the national Canadian economy, to parallel 5% of Indigenous economic activity with 5% of the Indigenous population roughly came out to about $100 billion. So to come to par of that uptake of how do we look at the investment, how do we look at increased Indigenous economic activity, At the time, that was around a $32 billion metric that looked at rudimentary perspective of only within a GDP construct. But when we look now today at a full spectrum of Indigenous economic activity, we see a massive development of Indigenous investment. We see a massive development around Indigenous assets. And we see a massive development around Indigenous land transfer. And the processes of economic justice is bringing Indigenous nations as powerful allies of bringing a foundation of our ability to invest, our ability to choose partners that support our values and ways of building economies from our nation's perspective within our territories. So all of those aspects, I think, become really important in understanding that we need to shift towards thinking that we're already within a $100 billion Indigenous economy. And while that was an imaginative construct at the beginning, in this book, I lay out $100 billion of Indigenous economic activity through mines, through land transfers, through investments, and all of these aspects that become really important to deconstruct the understanding of how Indigenous economic value is being created. And while we can understand how economic value is denied through the Indian Act and through the concept of Indian Act economics, it's equally important to really be paying attention to the trends of that question. How is Indigenous economic value being created today? And doing those estimates around this increasing land transfer, around economic justice and significant payments to nations based on the injustices of the treaties, all of these aspects, I think, point to this demonstration of operating within a $100 billion Indigenous economic target today, and that it's time to get ready for the next 100 billion. And as they say, the first 100 billion is always the hardest, so it should be easier from here.
So in your opinion, then, the Indigenous economy is growing exponentially as compared to the national economy. And as we continue on in that area of growth, you see that trajectory much higher and much faster than what we see with the, I guess, mainstream economy?
I think there's dimensions of GDP that do not actually position what Indigenous economic power and strength is. I think that to be able to look at the investment realm, to look at the asset realm, to look at the increasing land transfer to nations, all of these aspects, to look at the understanding of how equity ownership is changing the dynamics of that concept of Indigenous people having our seat at the table in decision-making places. I think also there's this demonstration of the realization of Indigenous peoples within the regulatory framework as well, of how value is being shifted in terms of, we look perhaps at the Squamish Nation of leading the regulatory process from an Indigenous nation perspective, and to bring into focus what is Indigenous economic power brings also into focus how we participate, how we identify risk within our territories, and what consent looks like, and how we de-risk the financial process overall within a larger Canadian context.
So with that, do you think we need to get rid of the Indian Act in order to fully unleash the economic potential of Indigenous peoples?
In my book, I essentially look at the language of the original Indian Act and, put that into common speak. If this was a person speaking, I refer to, in layman's language, the inappropriateness of how the language is structured, that the identification of ethics in it. What I do is bring into focus that question for Canadians to begin to be able to focus: is the Indian Act ethical? And I think that's a really important question beyond what I think of whether the Indian Act should be removed. I think I place the question into Canadian reality of, if it isn't ethical, what does that mean? If it isn't ethical, what do we do? and to realize and shape the narrative that so many Indigenous leaders before us have all spoken to. While there's the social, the legal elements, while I focus primarily on the economic aspects of it, I think that to invite Canadians into the reality of that question, to the leadership of that question and what that means, to be able to bring into focus that contrast of this is what Indigenous economic power looks like. This is how the Indian Act is holding back the economic development process, both for Indigenous businesses as well as key sectors and corporate participation. It is time to start talking about the Indian Act, and it is time to start talking about Indian Act economics.
So building on that, in your mind, then what is the role of the federal government to empower Indigenous economic growth? I mean, some of it could be certain amendments perhaps to the Indian Act or enhanced legislation to fully support and enable that economic activity. But just give us a sense as to your thoughts around the role of the federal government in this.
For sure. I think that we're seeing, periphery policies, the loan guarantee aspect, procurement. Those are all add-ons, if you may, to the Indian Act itself. And it isn't reaching the core of how the Indian Act is creating an exclusionary environment for Indigenous nations and businesses. And while that is solutions-focused, innovation-focused, there's significant advancement in rights-based approaches to economic justice. For example, we look to one of the most recent high-profile demonstrations of that is with the Robinson-Huron Treaty, who tested this concept of the historical value. And while I quite blatantly speak to this experience of future value of money exists for everyone except the Indians, and the Robinson-Huron group tested that and came out with no, future value of money does exist for Indigenous peoples, and it's essential that the Canadian government comes to terms with current and future value of the Indigenous economic relationship. So in that, I think it's important to state very clearly the Indian Act failed not only in our extermination, but also in the continued economic exclusion of Indigenous people. And I think that's what's important to be able to speak to is the failure of it as we demonstrate the rise of Indigenous resilience.
So you made reference to it earlier, but just tell us a bit more about, in your mind, what does Indigenous economic power look like today, how it's shifting, and tell us what you see for the future.
Indigenous economic power looks like a small, new Indigenous entrepreneur with all of their courage, believing in another possible future than what's been inherited in the story about us of who we are as Indigenous people. I think Indigenous economic power looks like the ability to test the Canadian bias narrative of the cost of the Indigenous relationship. That's in the forefront of Canadian reality right now, where to hold on to the narrative of, we look at this continuous testing of the historical treaties and the activation of the modernization of economic value and the testing of how Canada as a government and the Crown relationship has failed. What is coming to terms is highlighting the balancing, and I refer to that as the fire of economic justice, that the roaring of that, the quality of the fire that is in front of the upsurgence of Indigenous economic power. What that looks like is the rise of Indigenous entrepreneurships. What that looks like is the financial sector addressing and strategically engaging Indigenous inclusion and investment. While that may not look like the laid out framework of what exists within the mainstream process, what the rise of Indigenous economic power looks like is we see institutions like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank having an entire section that advances systematically the inclusion of Indigenous equity participation. It looks like regional governments building loan guarantee programs that advance Indigenous economic inclusion into key sectors and equity positions. What that looks like is the city of Saskatoon or Calgary building procurement policies with Indigenous focus, all of these pointing to the processes and the normalization of building pathways for inclusion that represents a interception or an interruption of the story of the historical economic exclusion that's existed. And those are some of the examples of what Indigenous economic power looks like.
Well, I have to say, you create some incredible visuals from your book. I just love as you reference the fire of economic justice. I think that just is so profound.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You wrote this book at Harvard University?
Yes, part of it.
And you talk about the support you had from the Honoring Nations program and the Harvard University Native American program. So tell us what that was like. Like, that would have been a really interesting experience, I'm sure. So tell us a little bit more about that.
It was great. In my work, I have a partnership with Fulbright Canada. So I was able to go down to Harvard and write for a couple weeks. And it was really interesting to be there at a time of heightened conflict as the Gaza-Israel war was happening, and there was demonstrations happening on campus, and this time of unrest. And I think my experience there was this increased focus of the clarity of what I'm seeing, of what Indigenomics is, of bringing a voice to Indigenous existence, and to realize that the long-term original effect of the Indian Act was our non-existence, to clarify and bring focus to our existence, what that means, and how we're activating our own future using the business tool is a powerful thing. So I felt very honored to be able to spend time there and witness that, as well as to have the space to clarify my words and leadership in bringing this concept of Indian Act economics forward.
So today we're seeing a lot of national and international economic uncertainty because of the geopolitical environment that exists. Do you think, in light of that environment, it is as great, if not a greater need, to really focus on Indigenous economic inclusion for this country?
Yes, I think all the indications of how far the advancement of Indigenous rights, of Indigenous distinction, have moved forward, and all of the aspects of how Indigenous self-determination is happening, the complexity that we find ourselves in, I think there's this understanding that stretches back in the Indigenous relationship to a time before there was even Canada. You know, we look to the BNA Act, we look to other historical agreements that advance the role of the Crown. The place of Indigenous leadership, of testing the relevance of that and our modern place in the economy, is a power moment. And to be able to reflect in the collective leadership of our predecessors as Indigenous leaders, as well as Indigenous business leaders today that have created multi-billion-dollar local nation-based economies. And I think to speak of this time in the future, this is definitely representative of a power moment that reflects Indigenous resilience and excellence.
Well, Carol-Anne, it has been an incredible conversation, and I just want to say how important it is to have you out communicating what many Indigenous businesses are experiencing. And yourself, you are also an entrepreneur, so the fact that you're able to speak from real life experience is quite profound. So I just want to say what an honor it was to spend some time with you and to have this conversation. And Nakumik, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clint, for having me today.
You've been listening to an interview with author and entrepreneur Anne Hilton. She was speaking with Clint Davis, CEO of Cedar Leaf Capital. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.